and welcome to our guests and comrades here in Johannesburg and online following the live stream. Welcome to our opening event of the series of Carbon Democracy Towards a New Global Transformative Social Contract. My name is Janine. I'm the director of the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung-Southern Africa. And it is great to see so many of you. And I'm extremely honored to welcome our speaker, Professor Michelle Williams, here today. Michelle will talk about the polycrisis and the undermining of democracy. And we, the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung Southern Africa, have developed this series on the occasion of numerous presidential or general elections in Africa in 2024. In Southern Africa and in the Southern African region, and a little bit beyond that, that includes countries such as Botswana, Comoros, Mauritius, Mozambique, Namibia, and the elections already took place in South Africa. And with regard to those elections, every country faces different challenges. Every country has a unique outlook, but the countries also have similarities. For instance, they experience the enduring impact of colonialism. And with this series, we would like to encourage discussions about democratic processes beyond elections globally. And we ask ourselves, what kind of democracy are we talking about? And who democracy, as we know it, serves? We will focus on different countries in the region, but we will also look at the current developments in Europe with the rise of the far right, and we will ask critically, has the left failed? Furthermore, we will discuss democracy in the context of artificial intelligence. So you can see that the complexity of those topics and questions is far too big to put it in one session. And at the same time, the importance of those topics is also too high to not talk about them. And that is the reason why we decided to start this series on the polycrisis of democracy. So in general, this series will be guided by questions like, what are currently the main threats to democracy? Where are these threats coming from, and how are they interconnected? We will also ask, what strategies can progressive forces institute to achieve socioeconomic inclusion, social and ecological justice? Basically, what we are trying to do is providing a public platform to facilitate critical discussions on the polycrisis of liberal democracy. And this really is a team effort. So with our senior program manager, Fredson, as the initiator of that series, but it would also not be possible without the communication support of Sevive. And also thanks to Siko, Refilui, and Roland for providing input and ideas. Thanks to Esther, Zanele, and Kolani for the logistical support. And of course to Tafatzwa and Lerato for making sure that we comply with our back donors regulations while organizing the event. And I'm extremely grateful that Professor Michelle Williams is introducing us today to the very broad issue of democracy in the context of a global polycrisis. Michelle Williams is professor and head of sociology, I'm always struggling with that word, but you know what I mean, and former chairperson of the Global Labour University at WITS. Her research focuses on democracy, transformative socio-ecological projects, environmental sociology, alternative development, and women's participation in political and economic spaces. So she is the perfect person to open this series on the polycrisis of carbon democracy. And after Michelle's lecture, Fredson will take over for the moderation of the debate. And now I would like to hand over to you, Michelle.
Thank you, Janine. Welcome everybody here in person and online. It's really an honor to be in this space and to be asked to open up this series, which is, I think, an incredibly important series. So thanks to Freds and Janine, the entire I say RLF, but RLS team here. It's really, I think, a wonderful initiative, and you have a great lineup coming ahead. So I strongly encourage everybody to stay the course and come to all of them. Is this okay if I push it back a little bit? Okay. Okay, so I was given an hour, but I'm going to speak for about 45 minutes because I think an hour is a long time for you and me. But so I should be about 45 minutes, which should give us plenty of time for discussion afterward. Okay, so the title of my talk is The Polycrisis and the Undermining of Democracy, as Janine has just said. This might sound provocative, confusing. What does polycrisis mean? And why am I suggesting that it undermines democracy? What do the crises of capitalism have to do with democracy? Because for many, capitalism and democracy are not only compatible, but are complementary. Many observers today raise concerns about the threats to democracy across the world. Some mourn the death of democracy, but at the same time, 2 billion people across the world are voting in elections this year. And many are doing so in a very dangerous context. They're voting into power authoritarian populist leaders and rising undemocratic politics across the world. We're seeing that we see citizens accepting piercing surveillance. We see leaders promoting polarization and xenophobic rhetoric. We see increasingly anti-democratic laws and policies, and we see journalists being attacked for their reporting. All of these developments are antithetical to democracy and are actually very dangerous warning signs. So while 2 billion people are voting, they're doing so in a very complicated and grave context. According to the Economist's Democracy Index, in 2022, 24 out of 167 countries, that's only 14% of countries, qualified as full democracies, covering a mere 8% of the world's population. And within this group, only 7 ranked highly in the category, with the rest hovering just above the flawed democracy category. For example, in 2016, the United States slid from a full democracy into the flawed democracy category, which is also where South Africa registers. Unsurprisingly, the strongest democracies are in Denmark, Finland, Norway, Sweden, Iceland, and New Zealand, not Germany, which is also where we have the strongest social welfare systems, the highest union density, and the high relative human development indices. But despite this, the right has gained some ground even in these high-scoring democracies. For instance, Finland, New Zealand, and Sweden all have seen growing right-wing parties voted into power or into government. And for the first time since World War II, Sweden has a fascist party in parliament. So this begs the question, what is going on? Why are long-standing democracies de-democratizing, and why now? Why are democracies in the global south teetering on the precipice of growing dysfunctionality and hollowing out of democratic and accountable states? This has led many to question whether democracy is even a good thing. You hear increasingly that it might not be right for all places and all times. So let me just state up front, democracy is worth saving. It is the only form of government that sees people ruling themselves, and it has been part of human history in various forms from the beginning. So in my view, democracy is worth saving, but there are very serious problems with democracy today, and that's what I'm going to speak about. But I want us to appreciate that democracy is not static, and it has had various forms at different periods in history. For example, neoliberal capitalism engendered market democracies that are essentially de-democratized democracies. In market democracies, states act on the dictates of corporate power, creating hostile conditions for their publics. Using powerful lobbies, international agencies, and direct influence, Omnipotent corporations influence states to pass laws in their interests. This is an exclusionary form of democracy, but it's increasingly the form of democracy we see today. So when I say democracy is worth saving, I do not mean that democracy. I am referring to a very different form of democracy. I think one closer to the actual ideals of democratic theory, what democracy has the potential to be. So I'm talking about a democracy that reinforces not only these basic liberal criteria, which we need, such as civil liberties, political freedoms, principles of equality, the protection from abuse of power by states and corporations. We need independent judiciary, capable and accountable government, or the capacity of the state is crucial. We need checks and balances between the arms of government and regular, free, and fair elections. These are the basic criteria for a liberal democracy, and they're necessary, but not enough. And that's not the kind of democracy I hope we aspire to. So I'm speaking about the agonistic and deliberative democracy that's based on democratic public power prioritizing social well-being, promoting commonly held life-enabling systems, strong democratic civil society, and embedding economic activity within the socio-ecological system. So democracy must include democratic practice, administrative principles of equality and liberty, but it must extend beyond the political arena to include the economy, the natural commons, and society at large. So it is this expansive and inclusionary democracy that I speak of, and that democracy holds the potential to realize. So I'd like to make clear, since we're here, home in Joburg, I'm not talking about South Africa per se today. I'm giving a general trend around the world of what's happening to democracy. In this presentation, I explore the ways in which democracy's imbrication with capitalism has led to the threats to democracy that we see today. For 200 years, democracy has grown up with capitalism, but it has been in tension with capitalism. And that's because the growth and profit imperative of capitalism is fundamentally at odds with democracy's imperative of serving the interests of the public. The ontology required for capitalism to thrive is based on conquering, exploitation, and expropriation, whereas democracy requires an ontology that prioritizes commoning, social and public goods, and the public interest. The tension between these two different rationalities plays out through powerful contesting forces trying to gain greater power over the state and civil society. It is essentially a struggle between economics versus politics, private interest versus democratic publics. And it's a tension that shapes the type of democracy we see in different periods of history. So after World War II, the tension was managed through expanding and simultaneously curtailing democracy, and by introducing massive social welfare programs, reducing inequality in the centers of capitalism, while maintaining exploitation, coups, and violence in the peripheries. The period of state-managed monopoly capitalism, what we also call social welfare capitalism, began to unravel as neoliberal capitalism introduced a new regime of social organization where corporations became more powerful than the states that were meant to regulate them. As a consequence, the enormous power of corporations, democracy-enhancing civil society, and democratically accountable states were systematically weakened. So you have growing power of corporations and the weakening of states and civil society. The weakened democratic state was turned to new purposes after 9/11 with the ascendance of the security state and surveillance capitalism, which are deeply inimical to democracy. So whether democracy will survive this new phase, these new challenges, is yet to be seen. But I will end on a hopeful note after painting a very depressing picture. The conditions that produced the mid-20th century social welfare capitalism, which enabled more democracy, were two devastating world wars and an economic crash. That's what led to social welfare capitalism. And in fact, the mid-20th century period of a social welfare state, growing standards of living, and low inequality was a unique period in capitalism's history. There has never been another period like it, not before nor after. So today we face many challenges that could end all life: nuclear war, climate change, and the rise of artificial general intelligence. And we don't have the luxury of waiting to see what the next catastrophe will bring, because it could bring the end of life. Okay, so democracy is in crisis. There are many explanations for this. It's a problem of governance. It's a problem of the eclipse of liberalism, too much government restrictions. It's a problem of representation, of identity politics. You hear many, many such explanations. But I will argue that these explanations miss the key point. Over the last 50 years, state power has conjoined with economic power, unhinging democracy as corporate power corrupts democratic systems. The struggle between political and economic power has been the central struggle between democracy and capitalism, and which one becomes more powerful at different periods in time helps shape the character of the society. So capitalism has faced 4 major periods of general crisis, what we call polycrisis. For those kind of old classical Marxists in the room, we're talking about a general crisis, but we call it a polycrisis today. In the late 19th century, we had a general crisis. In the interwar years, the early 1970s, and the current period. A polycrisis refers to crises happening simultaneously in multiple spheres of the economy, social reproduction, the political sphere, and now also in the natural world, the climate crisis. So each period of capitalism generated a polycrisis, and each period threw up intense struggles. Each period of capitalism had a different balance of power among classes and varied institutional forms and normative orders and values. So each period, class struggle combined with what Nancy Fraser calls boundary struggles around social reproduction, the natural world, and political power. In each period of capitalism, they found solutions that resolve key elements of the polycrisis. And the mid-20th century social welfare system was a result of the polycrisis of the interwar years. At that time, working classes in the centers of capitalism had enormous power, and democratic states adopted policies and laws for extensive social welfare programs. So you can see the working class has historically been very important in democratizing society. But this period of social welfare capitalism resulted in the polycrisis of the 1970s, which was resolved by neoliberal capitalism. So we are now in a polycrisis created by the tensions within neoliberal capitalism. And we are facing crises in the economy with the extreme wealth and power concentration, in the political sphere with the threats to democracy and rising authoritarianism, in social reproduction with the precarious existence of billions of people, not millions, but billions, and fraying social bonds. Communities and societies are hardly able to absorb these crises, and in the climate crisis, which threatens life on Earth. So the solutions capitalism is offering is exacerbating these problems. It's not resolving them right now. To resolve any of these crises, expansive democracy, the type of democracy I discussed, is key. So there are 3 criteria for democracy to flourish. One is the balance of power among classes must be in favor of subaltern classes, especially the working class and middle class, organized subaltern classes. 2, we need the strength and capacity of an accountable state and its relations to democratic civil society and the ability to regulate the economy, to regulate corporate power. And 3, we need transnational institutions and a geopolitics that supports democracy. So the history of democracy shows that the relative size and strength of subaltern classes, and especially the working class and the middle class, in relation to capitalist class and landed upper classes, is essential for democracy. You have to have power balance for subaltern classes and the middle class. The reason some scholars suggest that capitalism and democracy are complementary is because capitalism actually created the conditions for democracy to thrive by giving rise to organized and powerful working classes and disempowering the old landed elite. So you had the rise of trade unions and organized labor through capitalist production. But this was an unintended consequence of capitalist development and not inherent to capitalism. So today's financialized, globalized, neoliberal capitalism has disempowered working classes and worker organizations, and middle classes are increasingly precarious. Instead, it has empowered a plutocratic elite with immense corporate power. In fact, corporate power is so dominant that states struggle to even know how to regulate it. So alongside corporate power, dominant corporate power, we have weak states delinked from their populations. Unlike the strong and accountable state in the era of monopoly capitalism, social welfare capitalism, that was able to achieve social welfare for its citizens by playing an important oversight role in the economy, being able to actually get the economy to the corporate actors to steer in particular directions. Neoliberal capitalism dismantled the power of the state over the economy. So rather than redistributing the wealth of society, neoliberal capitalism eroded the social welfare regime and state capacity to deliver public goods. Corporations operate now under limited control, and even more insidious is that corporate interests and economic growth have become national and public interests in and of themselves. So in short, corporate interests take precedence over the needs of democratic publics. That's why we all obsess about GDPs and economic growth and all that stuff, even if you have growing unemployment, misery, and it not touching down and reaching the people. But because of these things becoming collapsed with national interests, we think that it's actually in our good. At the same time, the climate crisis now threatens all life. And market democracy's interests are so intertwined with corporate interests that the state refuses to take the necessary action to save us from fossil fuel capitalism and the plutocratic elite. So we have a state that's unwilling to act in our interest. Okay, but let me pause here to caution our celebration of 20th century social democracy. Take a drink. While state monopoly capitalism brought rising standards of living, low inequality, and flourishing democratic systems and universal human rights to the centers of capitalism, we must also recognize that these achievements came with severe costs. Social democracy was predicated upon colonial and imperial conquest. While the centers of capitalism rhetorically supported democracy, in the post-colonial peripheries, in reality, many countries were systematically prevented from developing democratic systems by covert and overt forms of political and economic intervention by states, especially the US state and the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA. So the interventions by states and corporations in the centers of capitalism. They used coercive tactics such as assassinations, coups, sowing conflict, and bribing leaders, and soft power such as partnerships, sponsorships, cultural initiatives, and artistic endeavors. In fact, we can see the recent protests in Kenya against the punitive and regressive taxation bill as a struggle against the anti-democratic forces of neoliberal imperial capitalism. In the case of Kenya, the IMF, with the US behind it tried to shape the contours of domestic policy. The bill would have brought further hardship on an already struggling population. This is an example of imperial interests of neoliberal capitalism trying to trump democracy, the interests of the people. What I am saying is that the high standards of living and expansive democracy enjoyed in the capitalist centers, the global north, whatever language you use, came at the cost of democracies in the peripheries. In other words, the centers of capitalism lived under the illusion of democracy by exporting the tension, the inherent tension between capitalism and democracy to the peripheries. The crisis of neoliberal capitalism, with the crisis of neoliberal capitalism, this tension has now returned to the centers of capitalism and has thrown up anti-democratic politics that we see rising in the centers of capitalism. So what I'm arguing is that neoliberal capitalism assaulted the three criteria for democracy. It weakened subaltern classes, especially in the working class, and it strengthened the plutocratic elite and enormous corporate power. It weakened the pro-democracy and redistributive character of the state. And three, it strengthened transnational corporations and their regulatory bodies that worked in their favor, in their interest, like the IMF. So power is now concentrated in this plutocratic elite with enormous corporate power. But the danger of capitalism is more than just structural. The insidious creep of neoliberal rationality also affects publics and their understanding of politics. Democracy requires publics educated and nurtured into democratic practices and able to prioritize public interest over private interests. Instead, democratic politics have transmogrified into influencers and celebrities able to shape millions through online engagements. More and more people get their news via social media with little distinction between fact and fake news. Authoritarian populist leaders are celebrated as saviors from the failures of democratic states. Xenophobia, toxic nationalism, patriarchy, racism, and religious fundamentalism are used to divide publics. Democratic civil society and democratic publics engaging in deliberative debate has withered. Neoliberalism has assaulted the everyday lives of people, their class formations, and the social bonds that knit them together, and has also shaped their capacities to act as citizens engaging in agonistic democracy. So one of the features of neoliberalism was the rise of a political and economic right that initiated a market democracy. So we know the Reagan, the Thatchers, these are the ones that we used to all really bash, and now we kind of look back on nostalgically, considering what we have today. These guys, it's a political and economic right, but they still worked within the broad framework of democratic structures. For example, the Republican Party, Reagan's Republican Party, did not actively try to dismantle the democratic systems from within the US state. The crisis of neoliberal capitalism, the one we're facing now, has engendered a backlash of a new right that is openly anti-democratic. It openly promotes exclusionary nationalism, religious fundamentalism, and it celebrates romantic notions of fictional histories of greatness. Authoritarian popular leaders like Trump, Modi, Erdogan, Orban, Zuma masterfully play on the disaffection and desperation of people. Increasingly, we see the plutocratic elite supporting these leaders. For example, Forbes has just released that Elon Musk is giving $45 million a month to Trump's 2024 election campaign. This new right's assault on democracy is leading to fascism. The recent US Supreme Court decision giving Trump immunity for decisions made while president places not just Trump, any president, above the law. The US president now has more power than any time in history and is at the same time untouchable by the legal system. That is fascism. I will now turn to show that we face an even greater challenges to democracy with the rise of the security state, artificial intelligence, and technological advances in surveillance since 9/11. So while neoliberal capitalism engendered a great deal of ugliness, since the early 2000s, three major developments have given rise to new powerful social forces with severe consequences for democracy. We have the rise of the security state, surveillance capitalism, and technotopia. After 9/11, there were seismic changes to the state and its relations to citizens and democracy that largely went unnoticed due to widespread and trumped-up fear of terrorism. And when I talk about this, as I said, I'm giving general. This kind of stuff is happening all over the place, but I often refer to the US because it has actually empowered corporations that have so much power globally. Governments in long-standing democracies such as of Western Europe, North America, and Asia all tightened their reins on power, passed numerous anti-terrorism acts, and increased the powers of the executive branch, the presidents, prime ministers, whatever the country has, intelligence agencies, and local police. So you think about all the conflagrations at local level as well. The local polices have been implicated. I focus on the US as the changes there threaten the foundations of democracy everywhere because it's empowered transnational corporations with new forms of power that operate globally. So the corporations that are getting this power in the US affect us all. So after 9/11, the US Congress passed legislation that gave the president unprecedented powers in relation to internal security, constructed a massive intelligence agency, and widened police power at the state and local levels. All of the changes made possible pervasive and intrusive surveillance that upends the rights of citizens from the national to the local levels. A security industrial complex was constructed, interweaving the intelligence community, various departments of state, and information and technology corporations. In the US, for example, there are now 18 security agencies, 18 security and intelligence agencies, hundreds of thousands of personnel, 10,000 facilities across the United States, and the state-of-the-art equipment, often military-grade equipment and technology. The security complex incorporates military components and information technology corporations such as Apple, Google, Microsoft, Verizon, and Facebook. All of these are directly working with the state. Together with the state, they conduct ubiquitous surveillance. Before 9/11, none of this existed. While the security industrial complex has some similarities with the US military industrial complex, it diverges significantly in that it knits together with the information and technology corporations and focuses, this is a big change, focuses on civil society at home and abroad. Basically, it tracks the movements, associations, habits, communications, finances, and faces of all of us. Other governments have passed similar legislation. For instance, the UK passed a Counterterrorism and Security Act of 2015, which allows the government to assassinate 2 UK citizens in Syria. This marked a sea change for democracy, as citizens were assassinated by their government without due process under law. It's a huge, it might not feel that big, but it's a huge distinction. To circumvent oversight and rule of law that we've all come to rely on in a liberal democracy, the security state in all of these places has created new legal and normative structures that include secret courts, a parallel justice system. So if it's about terrorism, it doesn't go through a normal justice system, for instance, and suspends habeas corpus, and the overlapping of private corporations with the state security system and the mining of privacy through invasive and illegal surveillance. Illegal under the normal justice system, but not under this parallel system. So in other words, the security intelligence structures are upending the cornerstones of democracy, such as the right to privacy, the protection of civil liberties, the protection of all of us, of individuals from omnipotent, indiscriminate, and unequal power of the state and corporations. Europe has actually gone further in trying to protect privacy, but even that, they haven't done enough. So government and corporate surveillance has now become so pervasive that privacy is now a contested right. Large sections of many publics also support such violations to privacy and rights. So that's why we see these increasing shifts to the right wing, to right voting, is that they're supporting these kind of developments. To give you an example from the US, a 2021 poll, 6 in 10 respondents supported the installation of surveillance cameras in public spaces. We see similar things in South Africa. People celebrate these cameras on all the corners because we're so afraid of crime. Local surveillance technology across society, such as traffic cameras, personal devices with surveillance capacities, such as our smartphones, I don't know where my phone is, but we all probably have smartphones, smart TVs, have increased government surveillance capacity by orders of magnitude. This threatens the conditions for democracy, which requires open, transparent public space where people are not afraid of intrusive government or corporate surveillance. So for example, in 2013, Edward Snowden leaked thousands of classified intelligence documents. I'm sure we've all heard of him. But these documents revealed the massive surveillance system embedded in 20 secret surveillance programs and the enormous internet data mining system, which began in 2007. That's all the stuff we all do every day on the internet. The surveillance tracked phone calls, internet use, and the patterns of life of people. The surveillance system required the cooperation of the private sector, as much of this data on the internet is actually held by private corporations on their servers and their data repositories. Many corporations willingly and clandestinely shared individuals and organizations, especially progressive organizations, data with a national security agency. Surveillance has provided the conduit to merge the power of government and corporations into a veritable surveillance economy that undermines democratic rights and liberties. The turn to social media by many of us, by millions, if not billions, of people, has essentially been a gift to surveillance corporations and the security states. And AI has massively increased the power of corporate and state control over our everyday lives. So it is in this context that Snowden's leaked documents take on such special relevance, as they vividly demonstrate the power of the security apparatus and the threats to democracy. I mean, it's a bit sad that there wasn't more mass kind of support of him around the world, because it is our security that he was trying to protect. The security state's tactics do not stop at online surveillance, but also include media intimidation and wide-ranging surveillance activities of civil society organizations through infiltration and various other ways. Every time a journalist is threatened, intimidated, and attacked, is chipping away at democratic's foundations. And we've seen this behavior in South Africa as well with some political parties. The limiting of peaceful protests by the strong arm of the state was vividly demonstrated in the UK in November 2023, when 470 people were arrested for peaceful civil disobedience. The protests were against the government's decision to allow new licenses for the North Sea oil and gas. They were basically climate protesters, protecting all of us again. These arrests were made possible by new legislation. Now listen to this: legislation banning any action that interferes with national infrastructure, any action, including peaceful disobedience. The pernicious act gives police sweeping authority to arrest protesters protesting against the exploration of oil and gas. They weren't blocking it. They weren't stopping it. They were simply protesting against it. Similar draconian legislation that makes peaceful protests illegal is seen in country after country and is fundamentally anti-democratic and illiberal. So the cornerstones of democracy are fundamentally threatened, which is why I'm so grateful that RLS is having this series. The right to privacy, the protection of civil liberties, political freedoms, independent media, all of this are cornerstones that are now contested rights. So to be clear, neoliberal capitalism conjoined political and economic power, but it still worked within market democracies. Today, we have anti-democratic political power conjoining with enormously powerful corporations, paving the way to fascism. I really can't emphasize that enough. There's a difference in the character of the political and economic power than we saw 30 years ago. So after 200 years, the inimical tension between democracy and capitalism is finally coming to a head. So what hope is there for democracy? I said I would end on a positive note. So while the situation looks bleak, there is hope. There are grounds for hope. The current polycrisis, as with all polycrisis, opens up the possibility for much, much more radical and transformative change that promotes socio-ecological well-being and the expansive democratic systems. All polycrises are when you have radical transformation, whether it'll be towards fascism or something Much better is up to us. There is more possibility for real anti-capitalist transformation now than there has been since the last 70 years. But I would argue it's not a return to the 20th century democracy, even social democracy. As I said, it was based on colonial and imperial conquest. The renewal of democracy today requires not only more democratic practices in the political realm, but it requires transforming capitalist social relations by democratizing and embedding economics. So the economy is key here. We need to embed it within the larger socio-ecological relations, as well as we need to challenge power of corporations in the states. So we must reconfigure economics to meet people and public interests. We need to challenge the singular focus on profits. And in the past, such fundamental changes came through world wars and complete catastrophes, but we don't have that luxury because a world war today probably would end up in nuclear annihilation. So today we must build alternatives in the concrete conditions in which we live. The threats are grave. We therefore must democratize democracy as a matter of urgency. And any future depends on democratic public power gaining control over economic power. It requires us demanding social well-being as prioritized, promoting the commons and commonly held life-enabling systems, our common spaces, a strong and informed democratic civil society. We must recapture that from the influencers and celebrities. And it requires a groundswell of resistance. The good news is across the world, there are creative, generative attempts to construct alternative economic relations and transformative politics in the polities, economies, and socio-ecological relations of the everyday lives. These prefigurative, counter-hegemonic experiments are democratic and ecological. They're feminist, they're eco-socialist. They're found in the global north and global south. And there's growing numbers of ordinary people engaging in these concrete attempts to build anti-capitalist systems and forge new ways of living within socio-ecological boundaries. So unlike the dominant alternatives of the 20th century, today's experiments are not at the behest of states, organized political parties, or powerful labor movements. Rather, they're largely created, practiced, and led by ordinary citizens and their organizations in local spaces in their daily lives, often through commoning practices. If the 20th century, this is for my academics or Marxists, if the 20th century alternatives to capitalism were characterized by a Gramscian war of maneuver that focused on taking over the state, the 21st century alternatives are more akin to a war position in which the entire edifice of socio-ecological relations are transformed from the bottom up, centering the commons as a common wealth of life-enabling systems. They are democratically organized, and the experiments foreground and exist between, with, against, and beyond the state and markets. So they're in this liminal space within and beyond capitalism. They're happening in and outside of. So over the past 3 decades, there's been an explosion of participatory budgeting, democratic decentralization, democratizing economic relations, degrowth movements, transition towns, eco-villages, local food movements, food sovereignty movements, solidarity economies, climate justice movements, and cooperative networks demonstrating alternatives to capitalism. Fish and I have been studying these and are currently trying to finish a book. And in all of these experiments, we see renewed politics of democratic civil society participation in which existing economic, socio-ecological, and political systems are engaged, pushed, refashioned, outmaneuvered, and worked around. Across the globe, ordinary people, including the middle class, the working classes, marginalized rural and urban populations, and precarious subalterns, are attempting to reconstitute conditions under which they live, and with the potential for macro-scale change through democratic systems. This means we need to promote the commons, we need to promote commons public partnerships, democratic public utilities, Democratize planning and finance. I mean, imagine if we democratized our finance and we got to choose what we prioritized. Valuing varied knowledges and developing informed publics. We have to democratize democracy across society. So the noisy, informed, and robust civil society that we see in a number of places in the world, including South Africa, is hugely important. As the many experiments across the world are teaching us, we must not only save democracy, but use it to rebuild anti-capitalist alternatives. Thank you.
Okay, yes. Hello. Hi. Once again, my name is Fredson Gilling. I am just going to play my role here as the moderator. I am not going to summarize what Michelle Nice has just presented to us because it will do no good to a wonderful presentation. Very scary at the beginning, Michelle. We had not agreed on that, but at least at the end, some very positive points about, possibilities for change, progressive alternatives going on. So I will now allow space for engagement. And if you would agree, maybe 3 questions from here and 3 questions from our colleagues who are following online. And I'm not sure if, are there questions already? Online? Okay, they're here? Yeah, okay. So Tali, I've got Tali, I've got Mpumi. So we start with Tali, then we have Mpumi. Sorry for some, I don't know their names, but maybe comrade there? Benedict. Benedito or Benedict? Benedict, okay. Okay, Benedict. Okay, and well, yeah, 3 and 4 is the same. Yeah, and Ozil. Ozil. Rosé. Okay. Okay. Sorry. Jose. Okay. Tyler, please go ahead. Yeah.
Thank you. Really wonderful talk, so rich. I wonder if you can share with us some good stories of a flip. I'm thinking about Poland. Why did it work? What's going on there? And also a question about the influence. You spoke a lot about the security and Big Brother and so on, very scary. If we look at autocratic regimes like China, cameras everywhere, is that influencing also the democratic world? Maybe to speak about the relationship between autocracy and democracy, even if it is a failed democracy.
Mm-hmm.
Hello, former lecturer. My name is Nompumelelo. I'm from Rethink Africa. Thank you so much for your presentation. I would just like you to touch on politics of identity aligned with the new democracy that we're currently experiencing. I think politics of identity, especially in countries like South Africa and like in Europe as well, when you see an influx of migration, how do you look into that? Because now, when you look at the fact that xenophobia is at its peak and tribalism also is at its peak when it comes to democracy and killings, and then when you look at countries like Sierra Leone, those Mali, Sierra Leone, and the ones that are forming Sierra Leone, yes, how they are closing doors so that they can rebuild. And as a result, there won't be democracy, but they're building their nation, right? Mm-hmm. So what happens then when people, can we breathe in Africa so that we can come to ourselves and find ways and solutions so that we can have an African democracy that is centered around our change and not this Eurocentric democracy that also inhibits our growth. So, yeah.
Benedict?
Thank you, Chair, and good day to everyone. My name is Benedict and I'm from Ceylon. Firstly, I would like to appreciate the presentation. It was good, but also I haven't heard you in your presentation speaking about the African democracy. You mentioned countries that they have strong democracies. Do you suggest that that Africa, there is no country in Africa that has a strong democracy as we speak? Yes, there are countries where there are conflicts and war, but are we really turning a blind eye to the fact that multinational companies that are thriving through the destabilization of Africa for minerals, for them to continue to make profits? I don't think we can turn a blind eye on that, because that also threatens our democracy. Then number two would be the role of civil society that is taken for granted in trying to make sure that Africa becomes the Africa that we want, all of us, an Africa that does not have any conflict and fights. Right now, as we speak, I think we have 6 countries that are military led, and that is on basis that the presidents in those countries and their states were funded by multinational companies to destabilize, and some of them were funded by the US government themselves. And that also goes to the question of security, because anything starts from the US, and I think we must agree on that. Everything starts from the US, and it gives us a problem as Africans. As an African young man standing here, I do not have a foreseeable future into leading my own country because of the unsustainability of politics that is funded for by multinational and the US. I'll pause there for now. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Benedict. Michelle, is it fine if we take, because I think we thought we're going to take 3, and then you would answer the 3, but can we take a 4th one? Sure. Yeah, Jose, yes, please. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Speaker. Mine is not really a question. I wanted just to ask us to look very closely at the trend that is happening in Africa. I'm talking about French-speaking countries. When we talk about Africa, more than 0.5% of Africa speak French as national languages. And the trend that is going in Africa, especially French-speaking African country like Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, and you go almost Gabon, like 7 or 6 countries have gone into ways, other means of getting into power rather than democratic ways. If I can ask a question or comment is, how are you foreseeing those kinds of trend of taking powers? I'm from Congo, DRC Congo. That is one of the biggest countries in Africa, and most of the people you learn on the news, the country is called itself Democratic Republic of Congo. I used to laugh. Our country, as a Congolese, I speak, we should just remove that word of democratic. How can a country call itself a democratic republic and so forth? You have just given a few examples of strong democracy. We didn't talk about any country in Africa, less even the Congo. So my question is, have you had to think or to have a closer look to what is happening in French-speaking countries?
Yeah.
We know that French have a very strong hand on many countries, but French now is like turning back this America, the CIA that is driving almost all things in Africa, that is really undermining democracy. So African countries now have to look for alternatives to bypass the power of the US. And I think that way is just going by coup. For those that are talking about soldiers, we have no other means than doing that. Because the democratic system is infected by CIA and America and all the others. So one has to surprise them by taking powers by other means in order to save democracy. Because you take it by other means, at the end, you come back to democracy. If you need democracy to bring in that vicious circle, will never be broken. Thank you.
Thank you, Jose. Michelle, please.
Thanks for the great questions. I'm going to end with a good story. I'll end with that, okay? Or do you want me to start with it? End with it, okay. Yeah, I mean, so in just the issue of whether autocracy, democracy, if they're influenced, yeah, I actually think what we keep hearing too, I don't think people see a value in democracy precisely. The Democratic Congo, so democracy, and that's why I started off saying, but that's not democracy. And so I was saying we need to refine, we need to build and rediscover democracy. So I think that it's not that there's a trend towards these autocratic, authoritarian ways, and people are buying into it. I mean, we even this comes to this other part of, Sierra Leone and some countries closing their borders, not having democracy, but building. So are we willing to throw democracy away if it brings development? That's the question. Why I spent time at the beginning to try to say, democracy is worth saving, in my view, because it really is the only form of government that sees people ruling themselves. We haven't actually had real democracy. We haven't had democracies which have that potential to have people deciding what they want. It does require a very developed civil society. It requires all sorts of things that we have to build, but it is the only form that actually sees us ruling ourselves. And therefore, I believe in people and our capacity to create public goods and to create the best interests. I would much rather have that than some plutocratic elites and very extremely de-linked people at the top trying to tell us how to develop. So yeah, I think that overlap is happening very much because we're shifting away from democracy. Yeah, so a lot of these ascriptive identities are very divisive. I mean, you were giving examples, Pumi, and issues of migration. I mean, it's whose interest does it serve to have us pitted against each other? It serves a very corporate, a very elite category. People, we could come together if we actually saw each other as equally kind of finding ways together. So all of these identities, I mean, when you look behind the ways in which identities are part of who we all are, but when they're used to, rather than celebrate us, they're used to divide us. They're used to hierarchize us against each other. There's always powerful nodes behind that kind of politics. And we must question those kind of identities. And I find the issue, I mean, migration, the truth is, migration's only just beginning. They expect in the next 10 years, 200 million migrants, climate refugees on our continent. That's just from climate. Forget about political or economic refugees is what we've been used to historically. Now they're talking about 200 million climate refugees just on our continent alone, let alone the rest of the world. So it's an issue that we have to start finding common ground and not blaming people and fighting each other. So yeah, I mean, so a number of you kind of are making the argument that I'm talking about strong democracies in Europe. The talk was meant to be about the global forces undermining democracy everywhere. And I did spend a lot of time on why I think democracies in Africa, in Latin America, in many places of the global south, the peripheries, are weak. It's precisely because you have corporate and state power behind it undermining these democracies. That's not new. That's been happening. And that's why I said social democracy was in part because of that kind of politics allowed the extraction and exploitation to happen already in the post-colonial period. During colonialism did that. Post-colonial, it was these other ways, what we talk about as imperialism. That, you come in and you pretend to have, the CIA and the Congo are, that's what happened to Lumumba. They're now the declassified papers show that they were behind Lumumba's assassination. That was already, 50 something years ago now. So that's not new. What I tried to do here, so I don't believe, at least if we talk about real democracy, issues of whether, it's not a European invention, and don't give it to Europe, and don't make a Eurocentric democracy. Europe didn't discover democracy. Democracy, and this is what I try to say, has been part of the human experience from the beginning. Different ways, communities. Often you have small-scale communities, Native American communities, African communities, indigenous communities all over the world would have democratic processes within their communities. It's part of how we have communally evolved as a species. When it gets scaled up into national levels and states, that's something relatively recent with capitalist development. And so that's why I think it gets collapsed with Europe and the US and a Western invention. But democracy, as in terms of people ruling themselves, does not belong to the global north, and nor should we give it to them. But it is about us deciding collectively. And I'm answering the few questions together because the issue of why there's no strong democracy in Africa is precisely, my analysis is about corporations and states preventing it from ever happening. Preventing it, there's so many examples on our continent alone, but all over the world. And so, corporations have and continue to have enormous power. And what I was trying to show is that in the past, you had at least a political power that in theory, not in practice, but in theory supported democracy. Now you have full-blown political power that supports authoritarianism, supports anti-democratic publicly. We can be anti-democratic and still get voted into power. So using the democratic system to get voted into power, and then they start passing all these laws that are against us. And eventually, this is what happened in the 1930s as well. Eventually, it leads to fascism. So we won't have those democratic protections. As I gave a couple of examples in the global north, it's already being eroded. It's already being eroded. You guys, all your examples were exactly the point I was making. I was giving a general phenomenon because corporate power, not just in South Africa, around the world, is undermining democracy. So you're not having democracy, you're having corporations and their interest being kind of prioritized above all else. And powerful states like the US state, like various Western European states, like China, like Russia, playing politics on the ground. So I think that the comments mostly supported the argument I was actually trying to make. Francophone countries. I think you were just making a comment that reminding us that much of the continent is Francophone, and absolutely, and the Portuguese side. And we often, at least in the southern half of the continent, we often, pretend or forget that there is a very large population of Francophone Africa. And I hear you. And but the corporations are working on all of those. So there's the similar trends that we're seeing in Francophone Africa as well. I think that was all the questions. Oh no, the good. Oh my God, the hope. Okay, so a place that I've worked a lot in and I always like to give an example of, and it's not the global north, it's from the global south. It's a state in India called Kerala. And Kerala, I've worked on for many years, and it's an exciting place because they're not they're not wealthy, they're not developed in the Western sense of development, but they turned the Western idea on its head and said, we're not going to go for economic growth first, we're going to do human development, and out of that, we'll have economic growth. So it's a state in the southern part of India, and it has first world levels of human development indices. It has much higher than the rest of India across the board on all these indices. But in the 90s, when most countries and places were in the kind of the neoliberal heyday, the Soviet Union had fallen and neoliberalism was kind of triumphant. So everybody was turning to privatization of state assets, neoliberal policies. Kerala says, they turned to participation. They did a massive democratic decentralization campaign where they devolved 35 and sometimes 40% of the state funds down to the local level. And they had these massive decentralization programs, development. It unleashed all sorts of vibrancy. It had tons of messiness and problems. It's not like no place in the world is perfect. And this place is messy and democracy is messy. So I don't want it to be, you don't go there thinking it's just all worked out. It's complicated and messy, but it's democratic and it's people-led. But what's really interesting is, so they have a lot of capacity and they do local things. It's not pie in this big stuff, like big development. It's not big dams and big things. They have some of that too, but they have much more local levels. So, you know, we need public health. We need rural areas having access. They kind of roll out a massive community-based, like we have our public health workers, but really anchored in communities. And they go and they have all sorts of kind of value-centered things happening. They call it the care economy. And in COVID, so there were 4 crises since 2018, and I think this speaks to the amazing stuff they've done. They had the Nipah virus, then they had 2 devastating floods, and then they had COVID. And in all of these, they just handled it unbelievably well. They're also very progressive and radical. So they're the one state where the BJP has not been able to make headway into. So they get discriminated against in terms of finances. So they're constantly being undermined in terms of public finance, but yet they still do amazing things. So for instance, when the floods happened, they had devastating floods. And you know, when we had our Durban flood, just the one city of Durban, we lost, Vish, how much? 400 people died? About 400 people died. And Kerala's floods that were part of the monsoon, which was much bigger, and much longer and deeper, communities were completely cut off. I think, and they were all very upset. I think it was 20 something deaths total over a couple-week period. And an example of what happened, that you had, you know, the local elected leaders, and you also have no party in power. They all have to do coalitions, and no party can count on power twice in a row. And the society says, no, they're there for us, not for their party. You know, so they've developed a pretty sophisticated civil society over. It's taken 70 years, but it's interesting. So an example, though, of the community ethics and the volunteer. There were all these people cut off in these backwater areas, and the big boats and rescue people couldn't get to them. The fisher folk, you had 6,500 fisher folk getting their boats, and volunteers driving their boats to these waterways. And they, in a matter of 2 days, had rescued apparently 65,000 people, just getting them out. You know, and through these very local level things. Then when COVID happened, they immediately, I mean, there's an element of, you know, everyone's very responsible. So when COVID happened and you were supposed to stay isolated if you had COVID and stuff, so the community would make sure you were isolated. They're not going to let you walk around, but they would also take care of you. So immediately within 1 week, and they had I think it was double the national cases, and so everybody was going to say Kerala is going to be a disaster. Before a single case happened, they already had their whole systems in place. They said it was going to be a disaster because they had such a huge case, because they have a lot of migrant workers all over, because they have an educated population. That's another story. They had a quarter of the deaths, and they tracked. There was no such thing as what do we call them? Excess deaths. They included those. They tracked everybody. But what they did is within a week, they had 1,000 community kitchens based from that decentralization. There's these women's groups, community kitchens cooking food. And sometimes they were feeding like thousands and thousands of people every day. So and the community kitchens were, if you had money, you can pay 20 rupees. If you didn't, you got fed. It didn't matter. There was no, and the state was subsidizing the community kitchens, which were being done by communities. They had palliative care volunteer groups who would go out to elderly. They took care of their migrants. The migrants who couldn't go back to wherever they were, a lot of them were in India. They made sure, they were like, these poor people are away from their families. Let's make sure they're cared for, that they have food, and that then we make sure that they had the medical care. So they had the opposite view of migrants, of like, oh, how sad for them. They're not with family like the rest of us. So they had this whole system where they were actually prioritizing care and human solidarity. And I think those examples show if you can develop, it's messy and it takes time, but it's possible.
Thank you, Michelle. I think I'm going to open up for more. Well, I have got two questions, but I think I will prioritize our visitors. Please go ahead. Your name first, and your question.
Thank you. My name is Tabang.
Tabang.
Yes.
Yes.
I'm from Alex. I wanted to come before my elder there. The question that I have is why is it that we are bothered when people make decisions about their own lives? So why is there a need for us to defend democracy when we are not interested in democracy? Because the world is taking a different posture. And I think the events that you spoke about, for me, where I'm standing, we're defending the defenseless because we're fighting the corporate.
We're fighting the what?
We are fighting the corporate. You spoke about corporate power versus state power. All right? And it's people that are driving the corporate in all aspects. Most of us, we work where we work, we do what we do. We donate the information that you're talking about. Volunteer. You said using smartphones, and we do all these things. Our information is being used in another way. So, are we not looking at this thing differently? That people are making their own choices in the way that they do things. It's what they choose, and this is what they want. You spoke about the direction that we need to take. It's a new shape in Africa that we need to take. I would put it, it's something that is very shapeless that we don't want to turn. And where we are in the continent that we are in, there were ways of doing things previously in the past. And I think you wanted to touch on it, but you were scared to touch on it. We had our own ways of practicing things. And cattle herding there was nothing wrong about it. Where you woke up and it was regarded as wealth and life. And it was development. Then we introduced to certain things that are purely different. And now when we want to do our own things, when we grow up, we learn that the women will walk around topless. There was nothing wrong with it. But today, we see people wanting to go back into that life where they walk around topless. And we deem them as wrong things in society, whichever way. So I'm saying, are we not trying to fight? In your closing remarks, you said, let's defend democracy, or let's democratize democracy. Where I am, I don't think we have the ability or the willingness, because what truly identified us has been taken away, and there is nothing really to stand for anymore. except to donate ourselves to the captains of the industry.
Thank you, Tebong. One quick more. Roland, yes? Microphone, please.
I think I'll just say two things. The first one is that communication. What is the role of communication and education? Because when we talk about democracy, we really need to have an informed populace, citizenry, to participate. The second one is, what do you think about maybe redefining what democracy is? Because like the previous speaker was saying, we have certain African examples. And I think that the problem that I hear from him is the delegitimation of African democracy, because a lot of that happened with colonialism. We have, I can give examples such as the Igbos. The Igbos were a confederacy. They didn't have kings. I can give the example of the Bijagos in Guinea-Bissau, women-led societies, where women decided when to get married, women decided when to build houses, and so on. And so I think maybe it has to do with a redefinition of democracy. And so maybe there is an ideal, and that ideal has to be adapted to the context. Like Cabral used to say, looking at the upward aspects of our development and anchoring our societies like that. And then finally, I think this aspect of it's always the US. There is a kind of insidiousness in social media that a lot of people consume unconsciously and uncritically. And this is really very dangerous. And this really also has to bring in another element that we have to look at, the role of social media. Because you see, for example, a lot of people praising Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, and saying Africa has turned its back on democracy and so on. But a lot of that has to do with long-term covert campaigns by Russia. We mentioned the US, but we didn't mention Russia. And although a lot of people around Africa consume this idea uncritically that Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger are the new Sankaras and so on, most of these people know nothing about these countries. Because when you hear about a lot of the rural areas outside the capitals of these countries, those citizens don't want these people.
Yeah, Roland, thank you. I also have, I think 2 questions. Okay. Yeah. My main concern, currently has been working about how we look at the working class. Working class has the transformative force in society and so on. And history also proves that they have been always, throughout history, very important in bringing about changes, strikes on the side of work, also the rights of women and children and so on. But it doesn't seem to be the same currently. It seems to me that organized labor is nowhere to be found. Is it just me, or you share the same sentiment that the organized labor is extremely weak? And why do you think this is happening? If you agree with me, so that's my first. My second question, that also speaks to my other concern, has to do with the new wave of right-wing forces that we are experiencing mainly in Europe, but we could say globally, which seems to be very hard to defeat. And why is it so hard to defeat? Is it because of the narrative they use? Because it becomes very confusing. And Trump, when he chose his vice president, J.D. Vance, I think that's the name. And the first thing that the guy said is I'm here, I'm gonna fight for the workers and the working class. So that's confusing. You see, so are they talking about, is this narrative, they've captured the narrative that traditionally is from the left. So, and this all definitely makes it very, very hard to defeat, in my understanding, these forces. Are they so strong or we are so weak? And what do you think, which strategies we have to put in place if you, if we have been having the same reflections, Michelle? Thank you. We don't have questions from our online. One question. Yeah, can we share? Where's the question? This one. Yeah, so the question is from Mtizora. Rosa Luxemburg Foundation was Rosa Luxemburg was very opposed to nationalism. What lessons have we learned about the ideology in the light of the 20th century's polycrisis? I don't know if I read, my English is a little bit Portuguese, so it's, I don't, sometimes I get confused whether it's English or it's Portuguese. But I think the question is, what lessons have we learned about this ideology in the light of the 20th century polycrisis? Yeah, well, there's no first here, but okay. Yeah, democracy and nation state. Yeah. Does it make any sense?
I think I got it.
Yeah, okay, perfect. Thank you.
I hope. Okay, great. Thanks for another great set of questions. Okay, so just so I'm clear, I do believe deeply in democracy, but precisely, Tabang, in some ways, because I believe that people should have the right to make the decisions. I think what's happening now, which goes to Roland's actually a number of the comments, but Roland's comments too, we live in such a confusing time, and there is such deep inequality, poverty, desperation, and feelings of non-belonging that I think many, many people are just wanting something else. So there's been good studies that just show that that people are, kind of tapping into Fredson's last question, people are wanting things just because they're making promises, but it's because there's a real desperation underlying it. So I think there's real material basis for this. So I strongly believe that we should support what people want, and I think that underlying that, I agree with you with corporate power, but I don't agree in that I don't think we have to fight it. That it's pervasive. I painted a very realistic but scary picture, but I think we can't not stop trying to change it and to fight it. And in some ways, I'm sure you've heard of the Kolobeni example. And they're, I think, such a beautiful example that just said, we don't want your development and stop forcing it on it. We have our own version. And that's democracy. I mean, that's forcing, they were lucky that we have a kind of constitution and a juridical system that supported them in that. So I think that's a great example where and that's what that's not something they just won. I mean, they've been organizing themselves for 25 years. They have strong civil society. There's problems within, but that's a great example of a community trying to determine what it wants itself and pushing back on anybody, corporate, state, the ideological arena, what is development. To be honest, I think the polycrisis has opened up that space. Development in the 1990s was much more seen as top-down. Now, there's much more openness for alternative versions of development because there's constantly pushback. Capital is in crisis, so they don't have the same monolithic, hegemonic narrative that people buy into. People aren't buying into it. So I think that's a hopeful moment. So I think we agree in many ways, but I think democracy offers that potential. I keep saying it's people deciding themselves what they want, not being decided from above. And Roland gave a number of great examples. And when I started off, I said it has been a part of human communities from the beginning of time. And there's lots of examples across where people, I mean, we call it democracy. So you say about redefining it. I defined it on principles. It's not a blueprint, but we do need certain things that allow for that kind of equality to happen and for there to be these kind of spaces where people can decide for themselves. So you need some kind of framework that allows it. And that's what I was trying to focus on. And I think for democracy to really be able to thrive, you can't have economic power hovering above. You need to have economies embedded in communities, and basically economic activity has to be socially and human nature centric. It can't be that you have an economy that just destroys the natural world, that destroys the people you have, and it might bring some development, but I would say that's not then anything we would want. So I would say you still need to have things like we don't want an economy and power lying outside of us. So I think there's principles that we need to be able to define what is possible. And then the actual structure and content and stuff, that's what people need to make up. So I mean, it's interesting that I wasn't trying to focus on the global north. I focused partly on the US only because a lot of those powerful corporations and those laws are actually what's making possible the muck that they're causing around the world. So I was focusing on that because they actually have impact everywhere. But I do think it's interesting that the places that have the highest democracy index have the highest standards of living, have the lowest inequalities, they have highest union densities, they have highest human index. So there's a positive correlation, at least a correlation or causation. To have thriving democracies, I think we could say you need to have social needs met, socioeconomic needs met. You can't have a thriving democracy with obscene inequalities. That's not democracy then. So Roland, I agree. Communication, education is crucial. And developing informed populists is really crucial. I mean, many of the great work that foundations like the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation and many others supporting these kind of activities that activists and people do is crucial. We need to have these spaces where people are not, and that's the thing, is that not just trying to win debates, but trying to go in and figure out collectively what we want. But it's not easy. And I think, to be honest, I mean, I'm in education, I'm in higher education, and I think our education system needs to be radically revamped. It breaks my heart to see students coming to university that don't actually like to learn because it's just become rote memorization and how you do, like if I had power to change education, I would throw out our curriculums and make education interesting and fun and, tap into everybody has ideas and interests and creative and not prioritize just the book learning. We should all learn to read and write and arithmetic because that we need to have, and we want that for equal, to be able to be active citizens. But, if people want to garden all day, that's what I would love to do. If people want to do woodworking or plumbing, I mean, we need everything and we need to value that. And I would turn education like that. If I could get rid of exams and all, I mean, to me, I hate that that's what it's become. And I think we would have a much more flourishing, vibrant, and you could have democratic citizenship, democratic thinking built into that. Kids learning how to make decisions in their classroom from the beginning. Even, I mean, so for years I was a chairperson of the Global Labor University, which is a program focused on trade unionists at WITS. And every class when we have these short courses, they'd have to come and make up the rules. And it's amazing, no cell phones, no talking, they're strict. And you just push back to the rules, but this is with trade unions. Why don't we start that with beginning, letting kids decide and learning how to run your schools. How do you make decisions? So yeah, I think education, but a new form of education. We need a very different education. So I think I've touched on, redefining. I don't think we should, I only think we should define the principles of democracy and the necessary components. We need independent judiciary. We need things that protect us because of all the power imbalances. But I think the content should be undefinable. I think it should be that then has to be from below and what people decide. And it'll look different in different places. Yeah, I liked your point about the pre-colonial democratic examples that were thriving. And those are what we need to value again. And I think there is a space. This is where I said the polycrisis also has a hopeful moment. Because I think that is, no longer is American Western hegemony and ideological supremacy, none of us buy it. If we ever did, a lot of us on the left never bought it. But, I remember, I'll give you an example. I teach an environmental sociology postgrad course. And for quite a few years, I spent 2/3 of the course having to convince my students that capitalism was the problem and that fossil fuel capitalism was the problem. Around probably 5 or 6 years ago now, the students were like, okay, we get it. What do we do? Like, I no longer have to convince people that capitalism is a problem. That's a shift. That's really a shift. And I know my students are just a microcosm, but you hear that often. So I don't think hegemony, people the hegemonic control is definitely weak now. So yeah, it's interesting. Russia, China, all of those are wreaking havoc. And so we were used to bashing on the West, and we ignore, or we sometimes, I had a very dear former student of mine. We had dinner the other night, and he was critical support for China. Remember that, Mish? And I was like, okay, what does that mean? But understanding the problems. And I think that has to be part of our discussion, because I think there are very worrying trends there too. With the working class. I think what I'm trying to argue is exactly the point you made, Fredson. The working class was powerful because of the way in which capitalism was, the industrial kind of systems, actually energy. The real change was when we discovered coal. Before coal was discovered, energy was largely from water wheels. And so factories had to be located near waterways, rivers. And so you didn't have a huge number of workers in one concentrated. You had like a factory here and another factory, somewhere else in England, for instance. And then when they discovered coal, energy was able to be brought to the factory. So then you have this concentration of industrial development in England first, in the West, where you have these cities developing, and you have thousands of workers together in cities, because now they no longer had to be out at the water. They had the factories all concentrated, and the energy came to them. So in many ways, trade unions are actually a part of, capitalism gave birth to trade unions, but it also allowed the organized working class to be powerful. And it's not surprising that, the unions that have been the most powerful historically were manufacturing, mining, transport, all these ones that had to do with the energy sector and these kind of things that actually were crucial to the economy. They then pushed for democracy. As I was trying to argue, one of the things that neoliberalism, it started already in the social democratic, social welfare period, was that labor started systematically getting weakened. And then Reagan and Thatcher went after labor big time. So we do have weak working classes. The South African working class is a slightly different story. But, when Cosatu in the 80s and 90s, when Cosatu spoke or did something, the country listened. The political elite listened. It is no longer, they've been split, they're factional, it's all, and I've worked with them for many years, and it breaks my heart because a divided, fractured, weak working class benefits corporate and state power, anti-democratic state power. It does not benefit a single working class person. So yeah, I agree that they have been systematically weakened. And what I was trying to argue is that it's because of the forces, the neoliberal forces. And that was when I talked about the balance of class forces, that now we have a very powerful plutocratic elite and weak working classes. And in some places, for instance, in South Korea, they also had one of the most amazing, powerful labor movements. The laws that have been passed there, if workers are responsible for costs to company, for corporate, for profits lost on a strike. Do you get that? I mean, that basically means you cannot strike. So not only is it that you tried to cover your workers' salaries, and that was a hard one, now it actually says, okay, for that day, the corporation lost 200 million rands, you have to pay us now for that. And so like laws like that break labor. And that's happened all over the place. We see these kind of laws that have made it very hard for labor. So now you have, I mean, like I'll give it, well, no, I won't go there. Korea, what they're trying to do now is, it's sad how bad things have gotten there. So again, I want to say, I think the right wing, the rise of people voting and looking to the right wing is because they're of desperation. Look at capitalism hasn't benefited most people. Why people bought into capitalism in the mid-20th century is because there were growing working classes. Standards of living were increasing, especially in the global north. In the global south, I mean, South Africa, there's a whole literature on the labor aristocracy of the union, so there was as industrial development, but generally this was something that was privileged in the global north. With capitalist development, there was an increase in standards of living. That started to change in the 70s already. And you now have increasingly very few people who actually even can get into the system. We have increasing numbers that are totally out of the system. You don't have wage work. This is why we talk about the commons. We need to go back to thinking about commons and people not needing to have wage work to have dignified lives. That's why the basic income grant, all these things are crucial, because we need to find ways that allow people to live with dignity and be part of the society without needing to be waged workers. So I think because increasingly, most people don't benefit from capitalism. There's an elite, increasing elite. I mean, you have Elon Musk saying things like, a future without workers. And you think, okay, how are we all going to live? I mean, we joke often, we're like, pretty soon university professors are also going to be like AI. You're not going to hear us anymore. We're not going to be needed. And we're not even wanted. The people would just rather hear what their AI tells them, and that's fine. It's pretty scary, but that's, I think, because people are not belonging. The system isn't even trying to help find ways for us to belong. And I think that's fertile ground for the right. The left, we've had all sorts of proposals for the last, we haven't had a visionary left for 100 years. That's a big statement, isn't it? I know I just said it, but I think I believe it. I think we've had, that has actually had state power, where you have a left coming in and just saying, we want to have people-centered stuff. We want to have social programs that actually benefit. We're going to develop an alternative. Yeah, I think I do. I don't know if I believe that, what I said, but I think I do. We haven't had a lot of visionary left for a long time that has had power. And I think that we are, and I come out of a Marxist tradition. I think Marx, we haven't done our homework. I mean, some of us are trying to do our homework, but that means Marx didn't have all the answers. It means, looking into a lot of other places. And so I think that we need to do a lot more work as the left. But also, I think the problem is we're speaking to the same problem as the right. They understand the problem like we do. And then they use our same language and promise to do stuff, and we don't know how to respond to that. So they're talking that they're going to be the workers' kind of defender. And the left no longer, can make that claim, because even when they've been in power, they're not the workers' defenders. So people, and for good reason, don't trust them. I think, oh no, Rosa and nationalism. Yeah, I think nationalism in the nation state is deeply problematic to having a really transformative, human-centered future. So I'll just give you an example. Climate science tells us when East Africa is having droughts, Southern Africa will have rainfall. And when Southern Africa has droughts, East Africa will have rainfall. So imagine we thought of our states based on watershed, or not even states, our administrative functions based on watershed, where we share watershed resources. We think beyond our national identities, and we start thinking about common watersheds, or water is crucial. So I think watersheds would be a good thing, managing our collective watersheds, so that we say, okay, well, we know that in this period of drought in East Africa, then we would be able to do much more of the agricultural production and farming, and we would see ourselves as one big watershed community rather than national. I think, we talk about global structures. I mean, it's interesting right now how just 2 days ago, the International Court ruled that the 1967 Palestine is illegal. So these international courts are actually now being more visionary and kind of courageous than a lot of national. So I think we do need to move beyond, and I think that is definitely in the spirit of Rosa Luxemburg. She was an internationalist through and through. And I think that nation states are deeply, deeply problematic.
Good. Well, we have 15 minutes left for what we had planned. Is that fine? Still good. Do we have people online, Sils? But in the meantime, I think I saw one hand there. Yes, please, your name? Okay.
I'm from Economics from the UJ chapter. My question, I'm so sorry for arriving late. My question is particularly for students. You mentioned a desperation for people who had identities, but I think that desperation is mostly common in the student population. A lot of change has been by student-led protests, and yeah, they are amazing when it comes to organizing and stuff. But now it feels like there's no longer that spirit of revolution, because we're so tired and we're so scared, because every single time most of us are depending on these corporations for bursaries. Then you move, you are a worker, you also depend on these corporations for jobs. So how do we give students hope? Because we saw what happened with Feast Must Fall. People revolutionized and they wanted change, but the government reacted so violently. How do we give people hope in that knowledge that whenever you want to do something that is going to change, or that is going to like grapple with capitalism and how pervasive it is, you know that either you're not going to get a job or you're going to get violated by the government. So where is the hope that is to be given to students in order to make that change happen? Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Siku?
Could I take the opportunity since I have the mic? Michelle, I have a question also relating to your comment about, which I think I also quite agree with, that there hasn't actually been a strong left force in a while. I want to ask you, what do you make of the EFF, right? Is it a valid left option, and is there a rejection of the EFF, or are they actually making any headway in our own democracy now?
Okay, so here. Your name?
My name is Agu.
Agu, yes.
Good afternoon.
Yes.
I didn't catch your name. I also came late. I apologize. I didn't catch your name.
Michelle.
Michelle.
Yes.
What this is about, Michelle, it's about white supremacy. That's all this is about. When the Birmingham Palace said to George Washington. George, sit down. He said, it's either you give me liberty or you give me death. They went down to the United States. They burnt down the White House. George won, though. But what you will say, Tabang, that why are we so concerned about people making decisions about their lives? When the Birmingham Palace, I'm talking about Queen Elizabeth, when she said, I am white and I'm supreme, she didn't say supreme to Africans or anyone else. She said, I am supreme to anyone who is not my blood. That's what she meant. And George said, okay, come down to the United States. Let's deal with this. They bent down the White House. Now, Hitler says, I am going to build a perfect human race. That's what that thing was about. World War I, World War II, there's no Africans fighting white people. It's white people fighting white people. World War I, World War II. But what is this about? This is about supremacy and privilege. You know, sorry, let me just, in the Middle East, there's a fellow called Michael. He's from the United States. He's a former Navy SEAL. They went down, 4 of them. It's called the Lone Survivor, that play they did. 3 died and they survived. Michael thought he was white because when he takes a piece of A4 paper and they say, what race are you? He says white. And he thought he was white. He was not. He went down thinking that, you know that thing they put there by the bases of the United States? Thank you for your service. He thought he was servicing his country. So now, this thing about Elon and Trump. Né? So the Middle East says, okay, what we're going to do, we're going to fund the English Premier League. That's what they're doing now. You look at Manchester City and everyone else. They are the big spenders there. They said, okay, we'll do this. But also,
so I'm sorry, we left with 10 minutes, and we need to allow
30 seconds.
Yes, please. Yeah, 10. Yeah.
Then it says, okay, let's get Mark Zuckerberg. You saw he was buying everything, né? Telecommunications, and he even made that thing of Telegram. What's it called? They said, no. Mark Zuckerberg is getting the money from the Middle East. Now let's bring in Elon, and he's going to buy this thing of Twitter, call it X, because they knew they would not have the money for the campaign. Now that's why this thing you're talking about, that's what this is about. And there have never been elections, so there will never be democracy. Ask Richard Gregory, a black comedian in the United States, when he contested elections in 1968, I think so. He contested.
Sorry, I'm going to have to interrupt you.
But what this is about, as Jane Elliott says, I think you know Jane Elliott. She says, all the white people that are in this room that know what happens to African people all around the world must put up their hands.
Okay.
And then they say, okay, why? Sorry. And then she says, this is very important.
Thank you very much.
Because she says, why are you, when you see this is happening and you know it's happening, why are you willing to allow it to happen to other people and not say anything about it?
Thank you.
White supremacy and others are white privilege.
Thank you. We have understood it's about white supremacy, and we need to allow Michelle time to answer to the questions you are raising. Sorry for having to interrupt you. Sorry for that, comrade. Michelle, we also have a comment from Maria Benavides. It's just a comment. It's not necessarily a question. She says the socio-political, economic, cultural, and environmental gains made by socialist movements in the 70s have been dismantled under the current regime termed a hybrid democracy. And she says this happened, I think, in the Latin American and Caribbean countries, mostly, I guess. So I just want to thank Maria. I'm sure she's following us online. Thank you very much for your comment. So then I will come back to Michelle. Sorry, Michelle, we only have 5 minutes left before
That's okay.
the end of our program today. Yeah.
Okay, so I didn't catch, I think you said Tabang. Is that what? Yeah. Tabang. Sebang. Okay. So, yeah, the desperation among students is severe, but it's severe in society at large. So I wouldn't say that, I think that's why I would say when people say, oh, you're at the University of Micro, you're at like an ivory tower. And I say, no. I think we actually have really a good sense of what's happening in society, because I think it reflects the broader society. And I agree, corporate power is an issue. And because people want jobs, that they are afraid. Why I talked about a lot of the creative attempts, I actually think the alternatives have to be built in the current. So I'll give you an example of what we've done at WITS. And we have a food sovereignty center, for instance. And we say we have, we did a study and we found out that we had anywhere between 400 and 4,000 students who don't have enough food, depending on where people are in their family's life cycle, the time of month. So on the one hand, there's a food bank where they give out hot lunches. But on the other hand, we said, we have a lot of land on campus. And why don't we petition the university to help give us some spaces where we can start growing vegetables and things, so we can decommodify food. That's our vision, is that we can have a food commons, that we have food that no one has to pay, that we want it has to be voluntary, and we have students. Huh? I was going to say, and we had them officially named the Rosa Gardens after Rosa Luxemburg. And so we basically are saying what we want. We before COVID, they were thriving. We had, I think, 6 gardens thriving. COVID happened, so we're starting over. But this year, the students are doing an amazing job. We have 3 gardens going. They had their first cook-in. But the vision is, imagine if all over the place we just had food growing. We could decommodify food. So people wouldn't have to be hungry. You could have fruit-growing trees everywhere, whether it's apples and pears and avocado, everything that grows. So we're saying, let's do alternatives. Let's build these alternatives. That right there is a huge attack on corporate power, because we're saying food should be decommodified. It shouldn't be in this agro-food system. So that's an example where we would find hope. And it's amazing, this year there's a lot of students involved at WITS. So start something like that at UJ. Come to our training, talk to us, and we'll help you, give you ideas. Okay, I will take Sigla Maria's together at the end. I agree. I mean, white supremacy is a problem. What I wouldn't agree is just because I'm a white person that I'm a white supremacist. That I don't agree with. And I don't think you were saying that at all, but I would agree that white supremacy, but I'm saying that because you said this is about you, Michelle. So I agree with you in that white supremacy is a problem. And that's because also there's a lot of supremacy, any supremacy is a problem. Hindu supremacy in India, subordinating Muslims, white supremacy. But the problem we've had over the last 200 years with white supremacy is they've had power, political and economic power, to wreak havoc on the world. So I agree with you. And I agree that that's something we have to deal with. And I think it's good for us to have these debates and discussions and make people realize and start reflecting. I think that's healthy. And I would never want to shy away from something like that. But trust me, as a university lecturer, your students keep you on your toes all the time. And I think all of us should be made to feel uncomfortable at times. That's what growth is, our ideas, our thinking. We have to constantly, as long as we can have respectful debate and we can respect each other. So I think that that's actually absolutely how we could get to a place where I want to be at a world where we really we see each other as humans. I know it won't happen, might not happen in my lifetime, but I'm trying to lay as many seeds as possible. That'll happen. You're much younger in your lifetime, perhaps. Zico. The thing I said, I'm not sure I believe. You're like, oh, I agree. I think, okay, and then Maria disagrees because she says in the 50s and 60s there were great ideas. And I think there were. But I'm talking, I think when I said that, I was thinking like really like huge ideas that we can just make the world fresh and new and transformative. I think there's been lots of experiments, and Carol has one great one. So there's been lots of great left progressive movements. But I think we're all a bit wary of grand visions and grand movements. So that's what I think. So no, I would say from the beginning, I have found EFF to be proto-fascist, fascist, and I find them deeply anti-democratic. Again, as I keep saying, I believe in democracy precisely for what Roland was saying, because it gives us the possibility to rule ourselves and to find ourselves. And I don't think EFF is that. I think they actually are part of, they are a part of the worst of the ANC. And I think the ANC also is deeply problematic as a political, I'm a political sociologist. I think parties are important, but I don't see many parties that I think are doing what we need them to do, And so I think we need to rethink what a political party is, what parties are supposed to be. I don't think we need people who are career politicians and are in there for their own power and wealth and all of that stuff. I think we should rethink all of these things. And we've flirted with ideas of party movements we have to rethink power fundamentally. EFF has a very authoritarian, masculinist, misogynist, some people say, version of power. And that's not where I would lay my hope. But my hope is very much in transformative alternatives through practice. Leaders, anyone who wants to be a leader shouldn't be a leader. That's my view, is that if you don't want it and you're willing to work hard, then we should have you be a leader and rotate. We should have rotational leaders, because you get tired. You get tired if you're really doing what you're supposed to be doing. You get tired. 2, 4, 5 years, that's a lot to be giving of yourself. If you're just, power luxury, then you want more of it. So we need to rethink leadership entirely and what political parties are. But now's the time, the drawing board, we can do this now.
Thank you.
You finally got your
Okay,
hope.
once again, Michelle, thank you so very much for your brilliant presentation and for this wonderful engagement. Thank you also everyone who has attended this event. So it's like Janine said at the beginning, it's part of a series of events that we are still running. There will be dialogues coming in on artificial intelligence as well, on far right politics in Europe and so on, so on. Lots of discussions that we would like you guys to still attend when they come. So thank you very much. It's 4 o'clock now. Please feel free to grab something to eat. We can still continue here our engagement for the next half an hour or so. Well, but without Michelle, I guess. She has to leave. And thank you so much for everyone. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot also for everyone who was following online. And that's it. Thank you.